Welcome to Practical Healthy Living. I'm your host, Dr. Thomalla. Today we're devoting the entire show to exploring the impact of suicide on families and friends, healing the scars left behind, and steps we can take to protect our loved ones from completing suicide. We're joined today on topic by teacher and author Elaine Kennelly, who lost her son Matthew. She's discussing her grief recovery through her new book, Finding Peace After a Suicide Loss. We're also joined in something positive by social worker Renie Hayes, talking about losing her son Jason and the important work of the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, East Central Indiana chapter. Renie, if you would, could you please tell us what is an Out of the Darkness walk?
It is a walk put together to raise awareness and money for the American Foundation of Suicide Prevention. My boss actually is a part of the committee for the Out of Darkness walk, asked me if I would be interested in being the keynote speaker because I've known her for years and she knows my story very well. It's something, like I said, I talk about it a lot because I'm one of those people that believes that's a way to get through something is by talking about it.
And what are you going to be speaking on?
I'm going to be speaking on what happened with my son and how I got through it. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. My name is Renie Hayes, but most people know me as Renie. My son, Jason Cook, killed himself at the age of 22 on April the 19th. I had to take him off the machines that were keeping his organs alive on April the 20th of 2007. I wasn't equipped to handle this. And I wasn't equipped to handle the pain and the guilt. There is one thing about losing a child for a mother that is helpful, and that's shock. So it was a beautiful thing because I was somewhat numb dealing with it.
Was there anyone there to help you with that process?
My family was there, my recovery friends were there, my son, but the decision was ultimately mine to make. And I barely remember the funeral arrangements. I was homeless and living in a recovery house for women, so my wonderful parents said they would pay for his funeral, so at least I didn't have that burden. I only remember things of almost like snapshots of memories through that time. I was 11 months into recovery from addiction when it happened, and I was already struggling with the guilt of how I raised my two boys and the wreckage I had created with my family, and this added to the guilt exponentially. I had had to learn to deal with the guilt and learn to forgive myself. So it's meant to be something positive for other survivors to maybe help them get through what they're going through with it. The first response I had to his death was to blame others, and I had a long list of people on that. About a week before my boy killed himself, he called the police saying he wanted to kill himself, and they brought him to the hospital. The hospital asked me to try to say something to him to change his mind. I had no idea what to say to him, other than how it would affect me if he did that. I asked the nurse to please help him because I wasn't trained to help him, and it was all too personal and emotional for me. The help he was given was medication, and he killed himself less than a week later. I also wanted to blame his dad for not being there for him growing up. I wanted to blame the school system that never noticed how sick my boy was and kicked him out at the age of 15. The truth is that every person that knew my son had a part in what happened, and I only needed to worry about me. I had to learn to forgive myself for my part and try to move forward. I didn't really understand that until about a year ago. I said I forgave myself, but I didn't do the work that it took to really make that happen. I had to realize that what I needed to do was forgive myself before I could truly move forward. We got a new psychologist at work about that time, And he made the mistake of asking me if I was okay one time during the work I was doing on forgiveness. I spilled my story to him, basically a stranger. Because that is what I do. If someone asks and I'm not doing okay, I say so. In recovery, someone once told me that we have the only disease that could be talked to death, and I applied that to losing my son. I have friends that have always allowed me to talk about it as much as I needed to, without trying to fix me. No one who hasn't lost a child can truly understand the pain, and I didn't want anyone to say they understood what I was going through if they hadn't. I didn't need anyone to try to fix me. There was no fixing a mother who's lost her child. If you know me at all, you know my story and what happened to my son because I talk freely about it. I need to be able to talk freely about it. No one needs to avoid the topic of suicide in my presence. I am strong. And now I'm stronger than I ever believed I could be. My son, since about 4 years old, was diagnosed with attention hyperactivity deficit disorder, changed medications a lot. And I only bring that up because when I went to college, I would write papers on what happened to my son because it was so real to me and I wanted to learn more about what possibly happened. And at the time, suicide for males between the ages of 17 and 22 were the third largest reason that they died. And they found a correlation with ADHD because it makes it difficult for them to get an education. It makes them difficult to integrate with friends, with family. They're almost pushed out as outsiders because they're difficult to be around. He was very difficult to be around at times. Impulsive, not a rule follower. The school really didn't want him. They tried to force medications and it was just really difficult. He did not have a diagnosed mental illness, but that wouldn't surprise me. And at the very end, he was self-medicating with drugs and alcohol. My life changed the day he completed suicide, and I will never be the same. But I learned to notice the collateral beauty around me and allow myself to feel joy. The first years were the hardest because my brain was split between grief, guilt, and joy. I have realized that I can live with all three. Sometimes the grief pushes to the forefront, and sometimes the joy does. I had two choices when he died: to face the grief without the use of drugs, or to use so I didn't have to feel anything. I chose to stay clean. That was the best decision I ever made. With that decision came the support of my recovery family. I don't know how I would get through everyday life without them. I also looked at what I had in my life and not what I lost. If I focused on losing Jason, my life would be at a standstill because I can't change what happened to him. Dwelling on it is not a good thing for my state of mind. I will never be able to change what happened to my son. I must find a way to live with it. I had another son, and I thought he needed me to be strong. I had a granddaughter and a grandson on the way at that time. I was told at the hospital that if that child that was on his way was a boy, they were going to name him Jason after my son, and he was a boy. I needed to be there for them, and now I have 3 amazing grandchildren, and they are life itself. They have no idea how much they've helped me and continue to help me. Yes, about a week, I wish I could remember exactly how long before, but about a week before, he had been feeling what like he wanted to kill himself. So he called the police, and the police brought him to the hospital. I was called at that time and came to the hospital, and I almost like they didn't know what to do with him. I remember a nurse saying to me, "Will you talk to him?" And I said, "I'm not a trained professional. I don't know what to say to make him better. Someone needs to help him, that's a professional and can help him. And then they gave him drugs to calm him down because he was very agitated. He was saying he was going to jump out of the hospital window. He was going to use their blinds to hang himself. And then when he finally calmed down and laid down to get some sleep after a lot of medication, the next morning I was called and he was standing at the guard's desk saying, "They're letting me go, but I'm still going to kill myself." And I said, "Son, please don't. We'll get you help. Just do whatever we'll do whatever we have to do to get through this." And he said, "I'm going to do it. And if you get in my way, I'll take you with me." And I said, there's a local home for drug addiction. And so I just thought, I asked him, "Can you go there? We'll get to see each other. We'll be able to do things together, just some type of help." And "I love you." That was the last thing I said to him. At least I know that for sure.
And how long was that before he ended his life?
Less than a week. The hospital incident and the phone call was less than a week.
And how did you find out?
I was actually at a recovery meeting in Dayton. I had been in recovery since May the 16th from my own struggle with addiction, May the 16th of 2006. I was at a meeting. When I got out of the meeting, there were people trying to reach me. I didn't have a cell phone at that time, of course. People trying to reach me, and they said he had shot himself. And I said, "What do you mean? Did he play with a gun and shoot himself in the foot? What does that mean? I don't know what that means." And my son was the one that told me, my older son, his brother. And he said, "I don't know, Mom, I'll find out." And maybe 15 minutes later, he called me back and said, "He's dead." That was just that blunt. That wasn't completely true. They did keep his organs alive. And when I got to him at the hospital, the same hospital that he was at before, he was, you could look at him. He was warm. He was breathing. His heart was beating. But the doctor assured us that it was strictly machines doing all the work, that it wasn't him.
And then you're asked to make this decision about his organs.
Yes, they brought him to Indianapolis, and he was kept on the machines overnight because it was too hard for me to make the decision. I couldn't think straight. I was exhausted. The decision was left all on me. I was getting conflicting opinions from people. And finally, his cousin said to me, he told me one time he wanted to be buried with all of his organs. That was the delay, is they wanted to keep his organs vital. And it would definitely have been a decision I would have made. But when his cousin told me that, I thought I'm going to follow what he said was my son's wishes. I tried to start college a few months after my son died, but I couldn't even think straight at the time. My split brain wouldn't allow it. I did go back about a year later and got a bachelor's degree in social work and a minor in psychology. I spent a lot of that time trying to figure out why my son killed himself. ADHD was a contributing factor to what happened to Jason. His behaviors made him a somewhat difficult child, both at home and at school. Addiction was also a contributing factor, and I have had to face the guilt of that as well. I will never know for sure why he did what I did, but I still have to live with it. I've been told that I didn't handle my son's death in a normal way because you rarely saw me breaking down in public. I grieve in private most of the time. Thoughts of what happened to him come unbidden through a song or a memory. I allow myself the time to grieve, then I grow into gratitude about what I have in my life. And I'm not talking about material things. I'm talking about things that are real. Someone once told me that I only talked about my son to get attention, and at first that made me furious. How dare she pretend to have any idea what I was going through? After years of thinking about that statement, I came to the realization that I needed the attention. I was grieving and needed people to be there for me. I'm not ashamed of that.
I can't imagine how what a difficult place you were in at that time. Uh, how does one cope with that? I mean, you're 11 months into recovery yourself, and then you get this devastating news. What do you do first? What happened first?
One of the best things that our bodies have is this beautiful thing called shock. So in a way, my emotions were kind of damped down, or none of it seemed real. So that helped a lot at first. But because I was living in a recovery house where I got clean, I was surrounded by people at all times that weren't trying to fix me, but allowing me to feel whatever I was feeling, to cry, to be angry, because my first emotion was to be angry and blame people. Well, this is the hospital's fault, or this is his father's fault, or definitely my fault. I was way up on that list, but angry, blaming, and luckily someone had the nerve to say to me that blame wasn't a spiritual principle. And I was really trying to change my life, my thinking, and so that struck a chord with me. Of course, it made me angry at first, but the reality of it was I couldn't just stay angry and try to figure out how to blame people. I had to figure out a way to get through it. So luckily, people just loved me through it, surrounded me through it, and never made me feel uncomfortable about talking about it. At least the people in the house I was at allowed me to talk about it, and in the 12-step meetings allowed me to talk about it as much as I needed to talk about it.
What has your journey been like since then?
A lot of highs and a lot of lows. I experienced the worst kind of grief I ever could imagine, and pain ever could imagine existed in the world. But to the opposite end of that, I was so grateful to want to be alive. Like I've never experienced that feeling of wanting to die so bad. So I experienced really high highs and really low lows. I started noticing things around me that were beautiful and feeling them deep. And I think a lot of that just came from recovery itself, because for the first time in my life, I wasn't medicating feelings. I wasn't medicating anger, guilt, grief, or joy and happiness. So there was a lot of guilt at first with the joy or the happiness, like I shouldn't be experiencing that. My first Christmas was unbelievable because he loved Christmas. And I brought him home on Christmas Eve. His birthday was December 21st. And the guilt I felt at feeling joyful about Christmas was, my brain feels like dichotomy all the time, like it's being pulled both ways at the same time. That's gotten better. The more I heal, the better that gets. So that's how it felt. It felt just up and down, and I, from one minute to the next, wasn't sure how to feel or what I was going to feel.
Now, you were 11 months into recovery, and you're living at a halfway house, a recovery house. A lot of people may have the death of a child be the foundation of a relapse. How do you think that you avoided that?
That's what I was going to say. People didn't know really what to do for me. And so they kept giving me money. And one person gave me her car to drive around because they didn't know how to help me. So they were trying to give me things like that. And I was in a car and I had money. And I thought I saw someone who looked like Jason. And I turned the car around and headed to Dayton. I thought, I'm just going to go ahead and get some drugs because I'm not going to be able to do this. It was maybe 2 weeks after he died. I thought, I'm not going to be able to do this. I'm not going to be able to keep feeling the pain that I'm in. And as I was turning the car around, I screamed as loud as I could in the car, no. And so I turned it back around, and luckily there was a meeting I knew was getting ready to start, and I went straight there, and I went in, of course, sobbing and said, I almost made a big mistake, and this is where I need to be. And so that's what I did. I went to a lot of meetings, and I talked about it. If I felt like I was going to use, I talked about it, and always thought, I have a decision to make. Do I go back to the place I was where I was getting arrested and didn't have my family in my life, didn't have either son in my life, and I was starting to build those relationships back, and I didn't want to give them up. I already had one granddaughter, and I was slowly starting to build a relationship with her. It took a long time for people to trust me, but it was starting to happen. So I think that's what it was. I started thinking I need to focus on what I have and not what I lost. And so I would think about my son, my older son, and my granddaughter, and my parents, and my sister, and my friends, people that were watching to see how I handled this. I would be there and can be there for anyone facing the death of a child because I understand. There's a line in a song I often think about. I am finally content with the past I regret. I will always have regrets about the way I raised my children. I did the best I could with what I had. I can't change it, so I move forward and find wisdom in the lessons I learned every day from living with the guilt and regret. Lessons on forgiveness in myself and others. I think the biggest emotions that I've dealt with were guilt and blaming myself. Like, if I had recognized how sick he was and not been in my addiction, then maybe I could have gotten him the help he needed a long time ago. So I think that was the biggest one. And it really wasn't until the past couple of years that I started recognizing that I really had to dig deep and learn how to forgive myself. So and that meant looking at the things that made me feel guilty. So I dug deep. I really dug deep and kind of said to myself a lot, you have to forgive yourself. That I can't forgive other people if I don't learn how to forgive myself first. So I'm saying a good 1.5 to 2 years of work trying to get through that. That's the worst one, I think, because I was his mom, and I was a single mom for the most part. My boys and they were my life, and I didn't usually hide things from them. So they were very aware of my life and my lifestyle. It was it's us against the world kind of thing, because I isolated from people and my family because of my addiction. It's kind of something you hide. So it's just like, they don't want us around. Nobody wants us around. It's just us. We're all we have. So just learning how to get through the guilt of not recognizing just how hurt he was and how much he was going through. That's the worst emotion. That's the hardest one for me.
Now, these years later, now you're a highly respected social worker, and you do excellent work. I can speak from personal knowledge of that. How did you get from there to here?
Always wanted to go to college. And after Jason died, I started building a relationship with my family. I think I had a lot of eyes on me when he died because I think people knew this was going to go one way or the other. Either I was going to use and go back to my old lifestyle, or I was going to start to recover both an addiction and from his suicide. So my dad said to me one day, the best way out of poverty is to get an education. And I had always wanted to go to college. It was such a dream of mine, but with addiction, you don't complete anything really. I tried, I went and I tried and I loved it, but never completed it. I barely graduated high school because of my lifestyle. So I tried to go to college about a year after I'd already signed up for college when he died. So I tried to go. It was a big disaster. I couldn't do it. I couldn't concentrate. I would just burst out crying in the middle of class. There was no way I could focus on it. I was so ashamed of that failure that for a while I was using a friend's van and I went and sat in the park and just cried all the time because I didn't want to tell anyone that I couldn't do it, that I was a failure. And of course, everyone completely understood when I said, I need another year to work on getting through this before I try to go to college. My dad's always wanted me to go to college. He bought me a computer, and there was a little bit of money that he had to pay to get me into college, just with the hope that I could do it, that I seemed determined enough, I guess, to get through it. And it was tough. I'm older. I was, in my mid 40s going with all these kids, but I had an appreciation for it that I didn't see around me very much. I was determined to be the best student I could possibly be. And I related well with the professors. They loved me because I was close to their age, and I excelled. I did very, very well. I had to study hard, and I had to get extra help from the student teachers. But I was able to make the dean's list every year, the chancellor's list one year. And then I decided to get a minor in psychology because that was my first love. That was what I wanted to do at first. I love people. And I wanted to study people. I didn't know if it was sociology or psychology or how I wanted to do it. But I overheard the person who is actually putting this walk together. Her name is Cinnamon Dunsel. I overheard a conversation at school one day, and she was telling a young girl that the Department of Child Services wanted social workers. And she said, and they would pay for the internship and pay for your last year of college. And the girl said, oh, I might do that. And she said, well, I'll tell you right now, they're really looking for people with life experience who are maybe a little older. And I thought to myself, that's me. I've got that. And it would guarantee me a job because I knew my age could be a deficit and my history could be a deficit. So I thought that means changing my major at the time was psychology, changing it to social work. And so what I thought was, I'm just going to try. We'll just try. And if it happens, it happens. If it doesn't, then I'll keep on with psychology. I loved every class I took. I couldn't make up my mind what I wanted to do. So I did. I tried, and I got a lot of support from the teachers, from the head of IUB social work department. I had to show proof of my criminal history and why I should be a professional with that history. And I persevered. I just kept doing the next thing. Whatever they asked me to do, I did that. And then the next thing, and I did that. And still, they wanted me in that profession because I definitely have life experience. So they wanted to know, how could I guarantee them that I wouldn't use again? And of course, there is no guarantee. I had to talk about what type of mother I was because it is the Department of Child Services. So, I explained to them, although I was an addiction, I took care of my kids. They were never homeless. They were never hungry, and they were very well loved. I had a lot of support from my family raising them, so I could always turn to them. They would never let my kids do without anything. So that's how I ended up getting a job with the state of Indiana, which blew me away. Like, here I am with all this baggage, but they still want me. And my self-esteem grew from college. It grew from the fact that, yes, I have this history, but they still want to employ me. And so I was determined to be the very best I could possibly be. No better than anyone else, but no worse than anyone else either. No one was below me and no one was above me. I'm just going to be the best I can possibly be. And I give 110% when I'm doing my job.
Wonderful. We're doing this show exclusively on suicide loss, suicide prevention. And it's very helpful, and you're a very brave soul to come and talk about your journey. And I think that gives people some insights into how to respond or what to expect if you must respond to an event like this. But from your experience and your training, what should people do to prevent suicide? What can people do?
Recognize the signs and not think that they're not serious about their threats if they make threats. I was told, well, he's made these threats before. He's not going to do it. I think he's looking for attention. And I wanted that to be true so badly that I believed it. He went to the professionals and it didn't happen. So I'm hoping through this foundation, the American Foundation of Suicide Prevention, that there are more funds and there are more services for people who are thinking they want to kill themselves. Someone put out a song shortly after Jason died that had the suicide hotline number all through the verse. And I wish I knew the name of the song. And before I do my keynote speech, I'm definitely going to find the name of that song. But I remember thinking, why wasn't that available to him? Maybe if he would have heard it, he would have called professionals who knew how to deal with what he was feeling at the time. I think about my son every day. I loved him with everything I had. I tried to get help, he tried to get help, but there wasn't someone there trained to be able to help with suicide intervention. That is why I agreed to do this. If he had a phone number he could have called with trained professionals at the other end of that call, it might have made a difference because he wanted help. If there was someone at every hospital, police station, and school trained to help anyone reaching out that could make a difference for someone else. The American Foundation of Suicide Prevention is raising money for awareness, resources, support, and to get the word out that there is help available. A song came out in 2017 called 1-800-273-8255. That is the number for the National Suicide Prevention Hotline. My boy loved music, and I wonder if he had heard this song, would he have called? I will never know. That if only one person did use the number and a trained professional intervened, then it served its purpose perfectly. Thank you for letting me tell my story.
Welcome back, friends, to Practical Healthy Living. And now we're in the segment called On Topic. And we're very fortunate today to have with us a guest. Her name is Elaine Kennelly, and she is an expert in the area of suicide awareness and healing from suicide when it touches a family. Hello, Elaine. How are you today?
Hey, I'm great, Alan. So good to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, you're very welcome. Looking forward to this topic. And that's hard for me to say because suicide is a scary topic. It's a hard topic and kind of dark. But Elaine is masterful in terms of talking about healing. And I think that's so important in our lives when we've been touched by such a tragic event. Elaine, can you tell us a little bit what makes suicide grief different than other grief?
Well, I think suicide grief is complicated. There are so many more issues that you face when there is a suicide loss. The person that loved one in your family chose to leave the family. And that's a difficult concept to think about and to grieve through. Suicide grief is not only complicated, I found it to be long, and it took me quite some time to get back to the healing and the healthy part of living again and enjoying life.
You've referred to the healing process as a battle or a battle preceding the healing. I'm not sure how that goes, but you also mentioned 7 areas of conflict. Can you touch on those a bit?
I don't know if they're in any special order, but the first one that I have thought about is sorrow. It is such an immensely sorrowful time that I struggled with, having balance in my life and being able to grieve and yet still functioning. In a workplace and within the family, we had another son. We lost our 18-year-old son to suicide. But
so
the
sorry.
sorrow was, yes, it was a difficult time. We were surprised. We really did not imagine ever experiencing a suicide loss in our family. And the sorrow was overwhelming. And that made the grief difficult. It was hard to deal with all of those issues. I found too that I felt so guilty. That was a huge battle for me. As a mother, especially, you can understand that as a parent. I felt very guilty. I felt guilty for years, but I did overcome that. And I'm thrilled to share that with your listeners. I also blamed people. It started right with myself. I blamed myself. I blamed my husband. I blamed his teachers. I blamed just everyone except my son, Matthew. I thought that was so interesting. Why did I not blame Matthew? But I went through all of those battles. It's the rejection. That was another huge one for a mother. When your child leaves the relationship, leaves the family, those are difficult things to absorb and work through. So it took me quite a while. And of course, one that we see still today is stigma. It's an uncomfortable subject. People don't know what to say, and they don't say anything at all. And that wasn't helpful. So there were quite a few battles that I'm sure you can understand, from your perspective too.
This is hard for families to absorb, and it oftentimes affects whether the family can stay together. What is the divorce rate for families when there's been a suicide?
Well, Matthew's suicide was quite a few years ago. And at that time, we were told we were in the 94% of marriages that had a suicide loss of a child. 94% ended in divorce. So our thought was, let's stay in the 6%. we really, it was difficult. It was difficult to, in a marriage, when one is down, the other can usually, bring them up. There's that up and down. But when you're both down and both struggling with the blame and the heartache and the sorrow and the rejection, it was very difficult. It took a long time for us. We did stay together, and I'm glad to share that with you. And I was really the one who was most willing to leave. And I remember it was such an interesting thing, because one day I walked out of the house, slammed the door, and said, I'd rather live by myself. Got in the car and drove and drove and drove. And I thought about this. And I thought, if I left the relationship, our little family would be broken up, and I would never really I would lose the one person, my husband, who really understood our whole situation with our son and understood the whole loss situation. So I came back home and was committed to making it work. And that helped me, because your mind plays tricks on you, right? I mean,
Absolutely.
you believe, yes, and you believe some untruths, lies, if we could use that word. And I really unfortunately believed a lot of lies, and one of them was that I would be better off living by myself, and that truly wasn't true. So it's, as you know, as a doctor, as a psychologist, that it is, grief can be a difficult journey. But I do think that suicide grief makes it even a little bit more complicated.
Now, tell me about healing. How is it that you get from such a dark place of hurt and grief to being able to heal? And what is healing like for you at this point in your life?
And I'm so glad you brought that up, because healing is the beautiful part of losing someone. We all have losses in our life, whether it's a job, it could be a pet, it could be just a less complicated issue than suicide, but loss is difficult. And so you don't want to stay stuck in that bitterness. I really was stuck for quite some time in my anger. I was angry at a lot of people, including myself. I was bitter. I was really not a very likable person. I didn't even like myself. And so I remember this again so clearly. One day I asked myself this question. I said, Elaine, do you want to get well? And that just hounded me for days, because I didn't like myself. I didn't like how I was treating people around me. And I thought, I've got to do something. I've got to change. Well, do you want to get well, Elaine? And I finally had to answer that with a resounding yes. And after that, I found myself thinking differently. And actually, I started smiling more. It was all little baby steps. It was all tiny increments, improvements, I called them. And it was smiling more. It was praying more. I was so angry at God through this whole situation that I really didn't want him in my life. And I was so angry, and I had so much emotion that I wanted to get out, but I was a little bit afraid of that. And yet one day I just really spilled all of my feelings out in just a rage almost. I was, just unable to do it politely. I just really, what shall I say? I was very honest in my thoughts and in my prayer. And that was a big step for me, because I felt that God had waited for me for this. It was just a real special time that I had in my prayer time. But it was also, I also learned that I had to give myself away. When you grieve, and I grieved for years. I mean, I'm not proud of that fact, but I do share that because I'm very honest about how I did this. I was stuck in grief and very angry, as I said. And when I wanted to change my path, it was a learning time for me. I had to unlearn some things that I thought were true and realize that they weren't. And so that whole process took a long time, but I'm very happy to tell you that I do have joy in my life. I have healed. And I would like that for all people who have lost a loved one to suicide.
I have to tell you, Elaine, when I met you a few weeks back, the joy that you can project after having so much grief was like a magnet that drew me to you, and wanted to definitely interview you for this segment. We have to pause here for a break, and so please stand by. And when we come back, I'd like to hear about the book that you've written. Welcome back. And again, we're speaking with Elaine Kennelly. She is the author of a new book that I find fascinating. Elaine, can you tell us what is the name of your book?
It's Finding Peace After a Suicide Loss.
That is a powerful title, especially if you've ever had experienced suicide in your family. Tell us about the journey that you've taken to write this book, and what is your objective in writing it?
Well, what I actually had to do, this was several years ago, I felt compelled to write because my heart really aches for people who are suffering after a suicide loss in their family or any tragic loss. It could be a homicide or a car accident. Those sudden tragic losses are so difficult to cope with. And my heart really is for people to be healed and to have joy in their life and happiness once again. I mean, we need that in our lives. And I thought about writing this book, and I wasn't quite sure how to go about it. So I actually went back into the pain and thought about what were the real battles that I had to get over and face. And I found that by defining the battles, that really helped me. Once I knew I was dealing with rejection, it was easier to deal with it. So I went back and defined the battles. And then I also went back to discover, how did I start my healing? What little steps did I take? What was important for me to get over? And one of the biggest issues, of course, for me that I had to deal with was the whole topic of forgiveness. And I really feel when there is a tragic loss, whether it's a homicide or a suicide, there are those questions and there are those people that you have to forgive. You know, most suicides are done by a gun or a pistol, and that wasn't my case. But you know, I was so angry, and I had to forgive people that I thought were mean to Matthew. You know, some of his friends were mean to him. He did make some bad choices. And I was very angry at the young man that introduced him to drugs. I had a whole list of people that I had to forgive. And of course, I was on that list. I I had to forgive myself. That probably took the longest. But I found that forgiveness was my hardest task, but my greatest reward.
Mm.
And so I think forgiveness was very important for me. And that was one of the greatest areas of healing in my life.
Thank you for sharing that. That leads me to have a question. And again, this comes from a personal place for me. One of the things that prevented healing in me for a while was if I experienced joy, excuse me, isn't that a betrayal? Do you understand what I'm saying?
Oh, I understand completely what you're saying. Yes. You feel, first of all, that you'll never have joy again and that you should not have joy. See, and especially in my case, because I felt so guilty and I blamed myself, which was not, I believed lies. I believed I was a lousy mother. That wasn't true. I believed I was a lousy person. That's not true. I believed that Matthew rejected me. And you know what? He left a lovely message for us, that he loved us and cared for us, and we were the best parents we could possibly have been. So I was believing a lot of lies. And one of those areas, when you talk about feeling good and having fun and joy, you almost feel like you are betraying that person that died. That it wasn't, what would you say? It wasn't right. It wasn't correct for me to be full of joy and happiness. That grief role became such a part of my life that I had to really, like I said, I had to ask myself, do you want to get well or do you want to stay here forever, Elaine? And I really did want to get well. And so, yes, I had to take joy in tiny little increments and say, it's okay. Even the smiling, I would walk around angry and my brows would be furrowed and I would, have a chip on my shoulder. I was not a pleasant person to be around. And I thought that just even smiling would help me. And it did. So just that small step of smiling. And I kind of learned this from a friend of mine, a really good friend of mine. She was great with strangers. She would always notice the clerk in the store or the person behind the desk at a McDonald's, at the ordering desk. She would be sweet to all of them and kind and loving. And she would just smile and say something kind and silly or just general conversation. But she always gave of herself to the bank teller, to the stranger walking down the street. And I started modeling her behavior. And that was a huge change in me, because now I started opening doors for people and say, oh, come on, go in. Those little steps of giving myself away helped me get started. And then, the ball kind of gets rolling. And then now you start being kinder to your neighbors. You bake cookies, you take it to them. Or at church, I really was able now to go back to church. I didn't always listen real well. Sometimes I counted the ceiling tiles, but I was there. And I became a greeter at the church. I didn't want to do this but my husband had signed us up and I said, okay, I'll go. But I was angry.
Good for him.
Signed us up. And so it was really kind of silly, or I should say pathetic. It was more pathetic than silly. But I would be there and I'd say, oh, good morning. So glad you're here. And then I'd look at Tom, my husband, and I'd say, I'm never doing this again. And it was so pathetic. But I got over that, and eventually I was there and enjoyed it and greeted people and could welcome them in. And just that giving away of myself. In my book, I call it the harvest principle. Because, we sow all of these bitter moments, and we reap the bitterness back. And I wanted to reap joy and give myself away in a friendship, or just in a loving, being a helper to someone, or baking cookies and giving them away. All of those things helped me to find joy again in my life. And I'm so thrilled. And I really do. And I did write this specifically for people to heal. And so this is a very healing book. And I would love for all of those who have lost a loved one in a tragic situation to be healed.
Elaine, tell us, how can someone get a hold of your book if they would like to read it?
Well, it's going to be launched worldwide on July 20th, which is just a few days away. It will be in bookstores all over the English-speaking world. And of course, it's on Amazon, it's on Barnes and Noble, and it will be in all the local bookstores. I also have a website, and I have a blog on that website. Once a week, people can sign up to receive my blog. And it's just a little thought for the week on how to heal. And the website address is suicidehealing.com, www.suicidehealing.com.
Thank you so much, Elaine. You have made a friend for life here. If you want to continue our friendship, I would be honored. And I'm so grateful that our paths crossed, because I personally have experienced the healing of your work. And I wish you the best of luck with your launch. And thank you so much. I told you earlier that when we did this, we were talking about perhaps how we could approach certain questions and bring it out in a positive way. And I said I thought that sincerity and genuineness goes a long way, and it certainly has. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you so much, Alan.
And that does it for us this week here at Practical Healthy Living. Sincerely, thank you for tuning in. Please join us again next week as we explore the impact of COVID nearly 2 years in. Guests will include Realtor Al Diamond discussing the impact of COVID on the realty markets, along with Elizabeth Hauser and Emily Slinghoff, who take differing views on whether it is better for mothers to stay home since COVID has changed the employment market. Should be very interesting discussions. Until then, stay well and keep exploring with the power of practical healthy living.